Cool. Just make sure I can go. Yep, great. All right, so the paper I'm presenting today, very different from the paper yesterday and very different from the paper tomorrow. So this one is on kind of ethical issues in behavioural and wellbeing public policy. And because this is a webinar as part of the ISQOLS proceedings, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the wellbeing aspects, but still give a fairly thorough treatment of behavioural public policy as well. This is joint work with Jessica Pikett at Birmingham University. I think she contributed the lion's share of the work on behavioural public policy, and I did more of the wellbeing stuff, but this is very much joint work. Okay, so the premise of this paper is that psychological science is increasingly influencing public policy. So this has had a long history. I don't want to overlook the fact that psychology has been involved in crime for a long time, psychiatry, social work, education, a range of other areas. But the big difference between that and behavioural public policy, in particular the nudge paradigm, is that BPP is applied in a very general way across all branches of public policy. So it's not specifically focused on certain venues, but it's just a general paradigm for thinking about public policy applications of psychological science. And we think that wellbeing public policy is emerging as a second kind of general way of applying psychological science in public policy. However, advocacy of wellbeing public policy is being met with quite strong critiques. And a lot of these critiques are reminiscent of critiques that were directed at and continue to be directed at behavioural public policy. And so we feel that this kind of sense of déjà vu suggests that we need some interdisciplinary work done that establishes normative principles for applying psychological science in public policy. So we're here to help with that. So we try to distill principles for well-being public policy from the normative debates over behavioural public policy. One of the key kind of planks of our argument is that BPP was successful, and by successful what we mean is that it had a good uptake into policy in the sense that it was widely used, widely popular with policymakers, and it seems with the public. It's kind of endorsed by the World Bank, it's endorsed by the OECD and other kind of major international policy organizations. And it's generally been, it's permeating public policy more broadly. So we don't mean success in terms of being morally good. We try to stay kind of neutral on these kind of questions. We more mean that it's been translated into public policy. So we think that it was successful in this way because of libertarian paternalism, which is this kind of political theory or ethical framework that underpins behavioural public policy and justifies it in a normative way. Now, the problem for wellbeing public policy is first that it lacks a kind of similar coherent political and ethical philosophy to underpin a lot of its interventions. We think this is partially because there's a tendency among advocates of psychological well-being and subjective well-being that these things must be a good thing. Like, how could they be bad? Which is, I think a pretty reasonable position, but it tends to fail to fully appreciate the complex ethical issues that arise as you transition from a laboratory or counselling or even a charity environment to government action. So once you cross over into that policy domain, the context shifts, and there's a whole lot of additional ethical considerations that you need to take into account. The second problem that we think faces WPP is that libertarian paternalism is itself quite controversial and doesn't map onto well-being public policy particularly well. So the solution that we propose in this paper, in the spirit of constructive comment, is that the boost paradigm, which is a kind of recently advocated alternative to nudging, is actually quite well suited to wellbeing public policy, although it is worth noting that boosting is quite a bit more strict than libertarian paternalism. So we're going to, I'll give the structure briefly. So I'm going to talk about what libertarian paternalism is, the critiques of libertarian paternalism, then I'll assess whether you can use libertarian paternalism to justify wellbeing public policy, and then we'll turn to this boost framework instead. All right, so let's talk about behavioural public policy a bit. So nudging, which is the kind of the core, very much the large core of BPP, is about making small adjustments to the choice architecture that citizens face as they go about life, that alters their behaviour towards better outcomes. And we'll talk about this better notion a lot throughout the presentation. And the way that it goes about improving these outcomes or by improving people's choices is by removing cognitive biases that affect their choices. So an example of this is default bias. We tend to not change things that we've been defaulted into, even when if we were just presented the two options and not defaulted into either of them, then we might select the thing that is not the default. So another famous and really straightforward example of a nudge is this fly in the urinal. So we've discovered that if you put a little fly sticker on the urinal, then men tend to aim at that fly and then there's less splash, right? So we get a better outcome and it's just a small tweak to people's environments.
Mark, can I ask you a question here?
Sure.
I don't know whether it's important, but since you make that analogy, you know, between libertarian paternalism and then WPP later on, I just wanted to ask a question here on the nudge definition. Because I mean, you know, the literature, when you look at that, right, and you, I mean, the one in italic, you know, basically here, you say removing cognitive biases, right? Often, obviously, what a nudge does, it nudges you, okay, towards better outcomes, but it rather rebiases you than debiases you, right? Is that an important aspect in your argument? Are you arguing for it's really getting rid of the bias, or it's also okay, you know, sort of like substitute one bias by another one?
Yeah, so in my view, it's not okay to just substitute one bias for another one. And I think, or rather, you need to justify that with some additional criteria beyond the ones that are in libertarian paternalism. So I'll come back to the fly a bit later, but in particular, ballot bins, which I'll also talk about, I think are much more sketchy in this regard, because you actually introduce a bias, or as you say, rebias someone towards something different. And I think that can be fine. Like it can be quite reasonable from a public policy point of view. I think the citizens involved might not necessarily mind, might endorse that in a reflective equilibrium. But I think that does have slightly more of a higher threshold to clear from an ethical point of view. If you're okay, so the core concern, I mean, there are many concerns, but the core of the problems with nudging kind of come down to the potential for subliminal manipulation. So the person who sees this fly doesn't necessarily realize that someone has put that there in a very conscious, deliberate fashion to get them to change their behavior. And then also the potential for paternalism. So you're changing people's behavior in order to steer them towards better outcomes. I mean, better according to who? So if it's just better according to the government and not according to citizens, then this would be a fairly standard case of paternalism. And, you know, paternalism has its place in our society, but is generally something that liberal democratic political theory is very nervous about, and something that it thinks we should be very cautious about introducing into public policy. So libertarian paternalism is an attempt to kind of find policy applications at the margin of paternalism, like things that are paternalistic but not so dangerous in their paternalism to be problematic, that can allow for the application of psychological science in ways that preserve autonomy and improve welfare. And it rests on 4 key pillars. These are effectiveness, autonomy, transparency, and welfare. So let me go through these quickly. So the first one is effectiveness. And this kind of consists of 2 parts. So the first one is cost effectiveness. So you want to be able to demonstrate that your policy has good bang for the buck. In the case of nudges, this usually comes not from the effect size, which is often very small, but from the cost, which is also very small. So in most cases, a nudge costs a trivial amount and then it affects a lot of people. And if you add up that small effect over a lot of people, you get good cost effectiveness. The second component of effectiveness is that you want to be able to demonstrate that these policies that you're implementing work, in the sense that you have good evidence base for both the underlying psychological dynamic and for the policy application of that psychological mechanism. So in the case of behavioural public policy, the argument from advocates is that all of these psychological theories have been established in laboratories using experimental methods, and then the policy applications have also been established or evaluated using randomized controlled trials and these kind of high quality identification strategies. So the example of this is the default bias. This is quite effective for getting people to change their behavior, and it costs essentially zero. And there's been quite a lot of literature establishing that default biases do work. All right, so then we have autonomy. So the idea here is that the critique from paternalism typically rests on the harm principle. So this is the idea from John Stuart Mill that governments should not stop citizens from behaving the way that those citizens want unless that behavior harms another citizen. So the way nudging gets around this problem is that it preserves all choices. So there's no overt coercion, bans, anything like that. Instead, you just steer the citizen towards a better choice. Critically, the citizen herself defines what better is, so we'll cover that under the welfare criterion. An example of this is physically obscuring tobacco products in supermarkets. So you can still purchase cigarettes if you want, but they're just not obvious. And so if you have an addiction to cigarettes, and that addiction is really triggered when you see cigarettes, then obscuring them prevents that cognitive bias from affecting your behavior. And maybe you, assuming that you want to quit smoking, will then not purchase cigarettes. Another example that I think is controversial and comes back to Malta's question earlier is these ballot bins. So a lot of cigarette smokers litter. And as a former smoker and sometimes smoker, I always used to get really angry when I saw my fellow smokers throwing cigarette butts on the ground, because it really annoys everyone else and makes us look bad. But it's nonetheless a major problem. So the ballot bin, the idea is that if you put up one of these things where people can vote on these controversial questions using their cigarette butts, then people are less likely to litter and more likely to put the butt in these bins. So the idea here is that your option to litter is preserved. There's no elimination of possible choices. You're just encouraged through the introduction, in this case, of a behavioral bias or a rebiasing to put it in the bin instead. All right, then we move to transparency. And the idea here is that we need to be concerned about this potential for subliminal manipulation. And interestingly, when you look at nudging in the context of the private sector and businesses, their nudging is often done very subliminally. And the point is to get you to buy more stuff because businesses are not as ethically constrained as governments are. So a big thing in moving to behavioral public policy, as opposed to behavioral private policy, is to avoid this kind of subliminal manipulation, because it's very ethically questionable. It seems kind of authoritarian. So libertarian paternalism insists that governments and nudges must at least be open about the intention and the mechanism of the nudge. You can have more stringent transparency requirements, but that's the absolute minimum. And any kind of subliminal nudging is completely illegitimate and unethical. To give you an example of this, this is quite a well-known nudge where you give people smaller plates in a cafeteria, and this encourages them to put less food on the plate, which translates into less food waste and less overconsumption and obesity. If you want to eat more, you can just go back for seconds. So the choice architecture preserves all your options. The transparency aspect here is that when this was introduced for the first time, there was a huge banner in the cafe that said, "We're trialing smaller plates to see if it reduces food waste. Feel free to get seconds." So the key thing there is that you are making sure that people are aware of what's going on. You're not just changing the plates and not telling them. All right. Welfare is the big one, I think, for us in talking about well-being public policy. So I'll dwell on this for a little bit longer. So as I've said a few times now, nudges try to make someone behave better or to make good choices. So it's quite open for abuse if policymakers substitute their preferences and their view of what is good into citizens' views. So it's ultimately what the policymaker cares about, what the person in power cares about, rather than the citizen. So libertarian paternalism insists that the good, or the definition of the good, must be left up to the citizen. So it defines welfare or well-being as preference satisfaction. And this is a very long-running way of thinking about well-being, in particular in economics, but also in liberal political philosophy. So a nudge can only be justified if it helps the citizen realize their own preferences. And this kind of comes back to Malta's comment earlier about whether you can rebias someone. Are you not then kind of changing their preference, but do they assent to it beforehand or after? And this is a very large issue in behavioral welfare economics, but we don't really need to get into it here. So the example here is that obscuring tobacco products in the supermarket helps a smoker who wants to quit, but can't quit because they keep being triggered by the sight of cigarettes to buy them, to in fact follow through on that desire, right? So you're trying to get at their true preferences. The key thing is that they define what well-being is, they define what's good for them. All right, so another example of this is the musical stairs. So often people want to exercise and be healthy, but our evolutionary psychology is wired to preserve energy. So when we see an escalator, we take the escalator. This is a cognitive bias. If you give people stairs that when you step on them, they make musical noises, then people will take the stairs because it'll be fun and they'll run up and down and get exercise. One last criterion that's not formally a part of libertarian paternalism, but that we think is important to acknowledge when we think about why behavioral public policy has been successful is modesty. So policy tends to be easier introduced and less controversial if it's modest in its ambitions. So an example of this in the behavioral space is EAST, which is this framework for thinking about the design of government communications and the way you interact with government services, that those things should be easy, attractive, social, and timely. And that improves the intelligibility of these things and the straightforwardness with which people can interact with them. So when you apply EAST, and I'll give you an example in a moment, there's no major policy change, there's no major spending, you're not introducing Medicare for all, and there's no major value judgments, right? You're simply tweaking the cosmetics of government policy in order to make it easier to interact with. So I think this is one of the least controversial parts of behavioral public policy, but nonetheless one of its most effective aspects. So you're achieving a worthwhile policy outcome through a small change repeated across a large number of people. So one example is this sort of thing. So government communications now really kind of bold the bits that matter to you. The fine print is on the back page because it doesn't matter. And then you're given like a QR code and you just scan that QR code and it takes you to exactly the website that you need to go to pay your bill. It's all pre-filled for you, etc. Okay, so we turn now to the critiques of libertarian paternalism, and there are quite a lot. So I won't dwell on too many of these because I want to get to the well-being public policy stuff, but it's important for us to cover these because we can see a lot of the traps that well-being public policy could also fall into. All right. So, yeah, that's all I said. Okay. I should say briefly that we try to remain neutral regarding whether libertarian paternalism is ethical overall, and similarly for boosts, we remain neutral as to whether this is ethical overall. We think it's an empirical fact that libertarian paternalism and boosting has been successful in convincing governments and policymakers to adopt behavioural public policy under these rubrics, and that's kind of enough for us. We leave the judgment to other people. All right, so we start with critiques from rationality. This is just a picture of some chocolate cookies hidden behind healthier food in the cupboard. So one of the a prominent critique of libertarian paternalism is that nudges prevent largely rational citizens from learning about their own behavior and making self-corrections. So some of Malta's colleagues, Mario Rizzo and I can't remember the other guy's name, but anyway, they've been talking about this a lot, that if you notice that you're always eating chocolate biscuits and that's stopping you from losing the weight that you want to lose, then you will take your own correctives. You will hide the cookies behind some other healthier stuff in the cupboard. You don't need some enlightened technocrat to come and change the layout of the supermarket for you. Another issue that's related to this is that nudges seem to bypass citizens' reasons for doing things, so you don't engage with their reasoning. And these seems to be kind of anti-democratic, because one of the democratic ideals is to operate in conscious recognition of people's reasons and to try to get them to express their reasons into the public sphere. Another issue is that if biases are so commonplace, then why are we using revealed preferences at all as a welfare criterion? I think this is something that a lot of well-being advocates get behind as well. It's quite a live topic in welfare economics at the moment. Another issue then is that there's no theory of subject formation. So another way of saying this is, why do people hold these biased preferences? Or why do they hold their unbiased preferences? So One question here is, well, if preferences are formed under non-ideal circumstances, should we take them seriously? So if someone holds certain preferences because they've been subject to extensive peer pressure or they live in an oppressive regime or something like that, should we take those preferences seriously, or should we try to infer what preferences they would have if they were making decisions under more ideal circumstances? Okay, critiques from Technocracy. So I've put up this picture of the Federal Reserve Board in part to emphasize that technocracy is not like a boogeyman. So I think often technocracy is presented as a kind of straightforward critique and, oh, this is technocratic, so we can't do it. I don't want to suggest that. I'm pretty allergic to technocracy, but I recognize that in many settings, it's quite critical. The point, though, is that we tend to only lean on technocratic institutions and technocratic solutions in quite extreme cases where there is really a huge amount of technical analysis involved. And so we need to be, if we are suggesting something technocratic, then we need to be alive to those concerns and explain why technocracy is an appropriate solution. All right, so in the context of behavioral public policy and nudging, the critiques from technocracy are as follows. First off, who rules the rulers? So if humans are subject to cognitive biases, then aren't the nudges also subject to their own cognitive biases? Who's going to nudge them? Who makes the choice architecture for them? What if policymakers just pass their own preferences on to citizens? So we've talked about that one a bit before. This leads to a kind of psychocracy. So the idea is that bureaucrats are guided by psychological experts rather than public dialogue and public opinion. Many aspects of behavioral public policy seem to concern value judgments. So should you diet? Should you smoke? What about green behaviors like taking shorter showers? These things seem to be value-laden concepts. They're not purely technical issues. And so it's not a case that you can be an expert over these kind of value judgments. There's an argument to say that there really should be a lot more democratic involvement in these kind of decisions. And finally, many nudges place the blame on individuals for their behavior. For example, over-consuming fatty foods, rather than looking at the social conditions that are leading to those behaviors. So this seems to shift the blame from the government and society onto citizens. So if the government has designed the city so that it's sprawling and you can only get around by car and there are food deserts, then it's unsurprising if someone always eats at McDonald's because it's nearby, for example. And you shouldn't nudge that person. You should change the social conditions that they face. All right, and finally, we have some critiques from Deliberation. This is a deliberative democracy setting. So the issue here is that citizen input is not taken very seriously in behavioral public policy because there's this view that citizens are biased. So this is what some people call a deficit model of citizen psychology. The idea is that they are dumb and erroneous and they don't think very well, whereas we, the enlightened policymakers, are superior, and so we'll make the decisions. Nudges affect citizen psychology and choice in ways that don't engage the deliberative functions of those citizens. So you're not getting them to engage in debate. You're not getting them to think about policies that will affect them. You're just bypassing their judgments. And if you do this across many, many different domains, then it threatens to reduce the overall extent of democratic engagement of the policy with policy. Sorry, the polity with policy. And I think you see this sometimes in the well-being advocacy as well, that there's this assumption that as long as we still have democratic elections, there's no chance for technocracy. And that's not quite right. I mean, so if you're squeezing all the democracy into this once every 3-year event, then you're really narrowing the range of democracy and expanding the range of technocracy. So these are all forms of what are called epistemic injustice, which is things that kind of oppress someone in their capacity as a knower. All right, finally, critiques from causal inference. I'll go through these quite quick. So behavioral public policy advocates reckon that they have a strong evidence base for what they do. Some people say that's not quite true. A lot of these interventions don't replicate very well. The underlying psychological science is also contested, and the fact that it's contested suggests that it's not settled, and so the evidence base is not as strong as some of the advocates might like to say. Then there's also these ongoing arguments over whether RCTs are in fact the gold standard. There's a lot of problems with external validity. They don't appreciate the full social complexity of choice situations, which is quite relevant in a public policy context, and so on. I don't want to say too much about that. So now we turn to, I think, the kind of meatier parts of the paper where we're looking at well-being public policy, or not meatier for everyone, but meatier for this audience, I think. So can you apply libertarian paternalism to justify well-being public policy? And this picture is some people trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, so you can guess that my view is negative. All right, so before I get to that, we should explain what we mean by well-being public policy. So I want to emphasize that we are talking about psychological well-being when we talk about WPP. So we mean by this happiness interventions, and this is any kind of policy that's designed to improve mental states. So the most obvious ones here are good moods and life satisfaction, but also more broadly, the kind of eudaimonic stuff, feelings of meaning, engagement, absence of depression, anxiety, and psychopathology. These are all mental states, right? And in the philosophical literature on well-being, mental state accounts are quite a long-standing perspective on well-being with a lot of advocates. We'd also list under well-being public policy, well-being budgeting. So this is determining policy priorities according to what improves life satisfaction the most cost effectively. We would exclude from well-being public policy what we call economies of well-being. So this is anything coming out of the capabilities framework, which informs, say, the Millennium Development Goals, a lot of the sustainability and fairness perspectives on well-being, and then, of course, the preference satisfaction account of welfare, which is the predominant way of thinking about it in economics. All right, so I'm just going to go through each of the pillars of libertarian paternalism and discuss whether this can map onto well-being public policy easily enough. So effectiveness. Remember that effectiveness has two components, the cost effectiveness aspect and the strength of the evidence base. So this is arguable, of course, but I would say that the bulk of well-being research has used descriptive rather than experimental methods. I think this is especially true at the level of the sociological scale research. So the stuff using the Gallup data, for example. And so the knowledge base is relatively weak compared to something like behavioral public policy. There's not as many laboratory studies. There's very, very few RCTs or similar comparable studies of policy applications of well-being science. And this is something that can easily be resolved over the next few decades. But at this time, it seems to me like the evidence base is quite weak, with some notable exceptions like the Healthy Minds curriculum, which I'll return to. I think using these kind of correlations to do well-being budgeting is very dicey. We have actually quite a poor understanding of these correlations, I think, given, in the origins of happiness, the primary regression has an R-squared of 0.14. This suggests to me that very large portions of the variation remain unexplained. And so we might have loads of omitted variables that are very relevant that we should take into greater consideration. And we just have this lack of knowledge at the moment. So doing cost-benefit analysis, which requires a lot of precision and which can have dramatic effects on policy, is a bit risky when you have this kind of knowledge base. It's also particularly important when you're thinking about policy change to have a good causal understanding and not just a correlation understanding. So for example, there was a paper recently by Oishi et al., an American psychologist, and similar arguments have been made by Robert Frank for quite some time now, that people tend to be happier under progressive tax regimes. Now that correlation is undeniably true, they established that well, but it's not clear that there is a causal relation between high tax and high happiness. In particular, these kind of regressions don't control for social security spending. There are a lot of other things that they don't control for, but this seems to me a really obvious one, because it might be the case that it's not so much the high taxation that's making people happy, but the high social spending that tends to accompany democratic governments that also have high taxation. So this is the kind of problem that economics has been banging its head against for decades now, and has gotten really obsessed with causal inference, almost going too far, I would say. But I think we need to do kind of more of this in the well-being space. So some reviewers have asked us to also talk not just about happiness and life satisfaction, but about other measures of well-being in this context. I'm a huge advocate of eudaimonic perspectives, so I really endorse this. But the best measures of eudaimonic stuff have not really been applied as widely in a kind of sociological setting or a policy setting as life satisfaction, and there remain a lot of concerns about measurement in this space. I mean, I think there's generally a lot of concerns about measurement in well-being, but the literature on, for example, the well-being profile is quite young. That paper just came out this year. All right, let's turn to welfare. I think this is the big one. Okay, so it's important to emphasize that well-being is not an atheological concept. So you have to define it before you can measure it, before you can operationalize it, and that definition involves a value judgment. If you're saying that this is what makes someone's life go well, that involves a very strong judgment of saying what is good and what is not good. So the definitions used in psychology, while quite intuitive in many ways, are potentially quite problematic in a policy context. So for example, if you say that positive mental states are good, which I think is universal to the psychological literature and is not, an not a particularly controversial statement. I think most of us would like to be happy, by and large. If you apply this in a policy context, it can start to have some pretty dicey implications. So for example, if the objective of government is to improve people's mood, then it's possible that government will improve people's mood by actions that are against citizens' preferences. So there's a very eloquent literature exploration of this in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is not necessarily dystopic. That's one of the interesting kind of aspects of that book. But in any case, it's not clear whether people's preferences are what we should take seriously or their mental states, and often these two things can clash. And in this case, I think it's important to bring up this paper by Benjamin et al. From 2012 in the AER, where they give people choice sets, so pairs of choices, and they say which one of these would make you happier and which one of these would you choose. And happiness is a very strong predictor of what people will choose. So there's coincidence in about 80% of cases. But there are also some where very few people chose the thing that they said would make them happier, so about 50% in some cases. So there's obviously a difference between what people prefer and what makes them happy. So if we think that only happiness is what's going to matter, then there are going to be cases where government is ignoring what people would prefer. Now, this might be fine. You might think, well, people have dumb preferences, and I'm sympathetic to that view. But when you start to say that people have dumb preferences, you are really straying into technocracy and the kind of authoritarian space, and so you need to be quite cautious there. Right? We shouldn't be cavalier about that. This is certainly okay in a therapeutic context, right? Your psychologist should tell you that you have dumb preferences, but this is quite illiberal in a government context, and we need to be sensitive to how the ethical requirements shift as we move across contexts. I should note that these mental state accounts of well-being, while very popular in psychology, have not been popular in philosophy for a very long time. And I think it's worth starting to engage with that philosophical literature more. And I think the Journal of Positive Psychology has done a really admirable job of getting papers from psychologists into their journal. Okay, this might raise the question of, well, why wouldn't happiness be a good thing? So often when I talk to my colleagues in this space and I say, this is kind of ethically fraught, they say, well, how can it be ethically problematic to promote people's happiness? Right, well, I'll just go through some of the kind of headline arguments. So perhaps the most famous one is Amartya Sen's argument about adaptive preferences. So we know from the literature on adaptation that people can get used to really quite bad circumstances. And we have this phenomenon of happy peasants and miserable millionaires. So if you're thinking that the objective of public policy is to promote happiness, then this would seem to have some quite perverse distributive consequences. So here with the happy peasant and the miserable millionaire, if my objective is to maximize happiness, then I should direct policy resources towards the miserable millionaire. And this seems to be distributively perverse. This person is much better, much more well off objectively than the peasant. Then adaptation kind of leads to a few other complications. So it's often cheaper to promote adaptation than to fix the underlying issue. And this kind of seems to let government off the hook from its obligations. So for example, it might be cheaper for government to help people manage their anxiety than to ensure that they have access to affordable housing. And you can think of similar things with climate change. It might be cheaper to deal with adaptation to climate change than to actually address climate change. Related to this is that attacking or helping people adapt to bad moods, for example, might anesthetize important political sentiment. So bad moods and dissatisfaction are important catalysts for activism. You might think, well, these homeless people, they're very depressed, they have a lot of anxiety, mental health issues, and that's true. And so benevolently, you might want to help them. But one issue there is that if you just focus on the moods and not the underlying social injustice, then you might actually reduce the sense of despair and the sense of injustice that those people feel that would otherwise lead them to campaign for a more substantial policy change. And I think this gets really perverse when you start looking at applications of well-being public policy that result in victim blaming. So I think a really illustrative case of this is welfare conditionality around attending positive psychology training. So in the UK and in Australia, if you are getting unemployment insurance, then you must attend positive psychology training. And, there's good reasons for that. Maybe you do have learned helplessness and these kind of issues. At the same time, what you're doing here is shifting responsibility for that person's unemployment to that person and away from the government, which has a really large role to play in the macroeconomy. So in the UK, for example, austerity policies undeniably reduce the amount of job creation that's going on in an economy. So arguably it's the government's fault that that person can't find employment. And in this case, you're saying, no, it's their fault. And what we need to do is give them some well-being training, right? Whoops. Okay. This leads me to a brief tangent, which is just to say that it's quite possible to nest well-being public policy within the capabilities paradigm. So the capabilities paradigm grew out of Amartya Sen's arguments around adaptive preferences, and it basically defines well-being as your ability to be who you want to be and do what you want to do. And the key thing there is that the emphasis is on the objective social and economic conditions that you face and the extent to which you can translate those into a better life for yourself, defined by you. It's very popular in development economics, very popular in economics broadly, very popular among anthropologists and so on. It's operationalized in the Human Development Index, the Millennium Development Goals, and the Sustainable Development Goals. If you're framing well-being public policy in this way, what you do is you say, well, we're going to give people mental skills, practical wisdom, the ability to make better choices in terms of their well-being. And then that helps them be who they want to be and do what they want to do. So for example, if you help people with mindfulness training, then they're able to be calmer under pressure and these kind of things. And so they'll be able to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So the policy objective then is framed in terms of capabilities, but psychological well-being is a byproduct. Okay, on autonomy, so I'm nearly done here. Some advocates argue that well-being public policy is more respectful of autonomy than existing paradigms like revealed preferences. So I have two quotes here from Clark et al. And Fridays et al., which is basically the same people, just different author orders, saying things like, life satisfaction is democratic. It allows individuals to assess their lives on the basis of whatever they consider important to themselves, and it takes them seriously as political agents and sets them on top of the judgment tree. I think these are very important sentiments, very noble sentiments, and I fully endorse the idea that we should take people seriously and put them on top of the judgment tree. But I think it's a little bit questionable whether life satisfaction research in fact does this, because what happens in practice is that you ask people what their life satisfaction is, you put that number on the left-hand side of a regression equation, and then the right-hand side of that equation is populated by variables the researchers choose, not the citizens. And so this to me seems no better than behavioral public policy. The reason why we do this in research is because that we're worried if we directly ask people what makes them happy, we're going to trigger various cognitive biases, recall bias, social desirability bias, all the rest of it. Now, it might be a very good research practice, but again, as we move contexts from research to public policy, we need to be aware that the situation changes. So we might need to ask people more directly what makes them happy, and we might need to be a little bit cautious about saying that they're full of biases, because if they're full of biases, then maybe we just shouldn't trust their subjective judgments and we should look at objective factors instead. I really worry sometimes that we kind of dig our own holes with a lot of this biases business. All right. Finally, transparency. I think transparency is an area where well-being public policy is very strong, much better than behavioral public policy. So well-being public policy is usually announced with a whole bunch of fanfare. You can look at the New Zealand case, the Bhutan case, the Wales case, and it's very rarely subliminal in practice. It's usually very loud, very clear. The only thing that's a little bit intransparent sometimes or opaque is what kind of well-being you're promoting. So is it capabilities? Is it life satisfaction? Is it the opposite of depression? Something like that. But I think this is quite a minor concern, strong on transparency. All right, so to summarize that section, we're essentially arguing that it's hard to justify libertarian paternalism hard to justify well-being public policy under libertarian paternalism because of limited effectiveness at the moment and critiques from welfare and autonomy, and especially from welfare. So in the spirit of trying to say something more helpful and constructive, we propose that boosts is a feasible framework that you can justify a lot of well-being public policy under the heading of. There's some similarities between boosts and capabilities, but boosting was really developed specifically for applying psychological science in public policy. So it's tailored to the context that we're working in. The key difference between nudging and boosting is that where nudge is kind of technocratic guidance of citizen choices, boosting is about going to the citizens, working with them and trying to improve their capacity for self-guidance. So you're trying to increase the wisdom that they have around their own psychology. Boosts replace this deficit, irrational behavior view of the human with what's called ecological rationality, which is the view that our psychology has evolved over millions of years to keep us alive. And it's done a really good job of that. But the contemporary present circumstances are slightly different from our evolutionary circumstances. And so we need to be aware of how our very effective and rational psychology manifests differently in different circumstances and might get us into trouble sometimes. So it tries to do things like inculcating good habits, helping people to think more sophisticated about risk and implement effective self-regulation. We've tried to distill down 3 key principles of boosting that you can then check whether any proposed well-being public policy meets these 3 criteria. So the first criteria is capacity. If for something to be a boost, it's got to be educative and it's got to be sustainable over the long term. So if you're doing an intervention and it's only going to last 5 seconds, it's not going to be a boost. So the reason why this is important, or one of the reasons why it's important, is that it gets around a lot of the consequences of adaptive preferences. So it keeps the focus on, in a sense, objective improvements in someone's capabilities. Right? That means that you're not getting them used to something. You're making them objectively better. You must be increasing their options. The next criteria is what we call the empowerment principle. This is that you have to be helping recipients to better understand how their psychology manifests in different circumstances and how to harness it. So this tries to get around the victim blaming issue, the idea that you're responsible for being sad, right? So the idea is that you're working with them and you're not going to be accusing them of having dumb preferences. You're going to be working with them to see how their preferences have formed, for what reasons, why they have formed that way, what were the reasonable grounds for them to form in that fashion, but how that doesn't work in other contexts. And then finally, we have participation. This is the idea that boosts should not only be transparent, but actually they require the conscious cooperation of the people being boosted. So you've got to get them into the room with you. You've got to get them involved in the public policy. And this is going to protect you against paternalism. It's going to protect you against technocracy and this notion of dumb preferences and we, the enlightened, know better than the citizens, what's best for them. And it's going to promote deliberation, collective activity, democratic engagement, all this kind of good stuff. Yeah, okay, I won't want to do that last point because I'm running over time. So very quickly in the last 2 minutes, I'll just give a few examples. So the first example is not a boost. So we're looking at this welfare conditionality where you have to go to positive psychology training. So this gives recipients training in psychological skills. So it meets the capacity principle, but it involves a lot of victim blaming. Saying you're responsible for your failure to find employment and it's because you don't think positively. That seems to break the empowerment principle. And it's also mandatory and quite coercive. You know, if you don't go, then you're destitute. So this would seem to break the participation principle. And you've got to encourage people to get involved, not force them to get involved. So overall, this is not a boost. The Healthy Minds curriculum, I would say, is much closer to a boost, and I'd be happy to give it the boost label. So Healthy Minds is a program designed for primary and I think mostly high school students that gives them training in a range of psychological ideas like mindfulness, mood management, gratitude, some of the basic aspects of behavioral psychology as well. And the idea is to make them more aware of their psychology and better able to harness it in a variety of contexts to help themselves flourish. So I think it's a capacity thing for sure. You're giving people durable psychological skills that function across multiple contexts. It's empowering. You're helping them to understand their psychology better and how to respond appropriately. So you've got examples of how to recognize good stress before exams, which is helping you stay motivated, and bad stress, which is like anxiety, chronic anxiety, rumination, this kind of stuff. You could, if you misapplied the Healthy Minds curriculum, transgress the empowerment principle if you only targeted, say, underperforming students, right? So you say, well, these students who are doing well, they're fine. They obviously know their psychology. These bad students, they're not doing well. It must be because they're like psychologically deficient and we need to give them some training. What you're risking there is that you're not going to take account of the social and economic conditions that have led to that psychology that those people are manifesting, right? And so what you're doing there is, again, kind of engaging in this victim blaming issue. And then finally, we have participation. I think this is where it's a bit tricky. You know, in high school, we do have some coercive mechanisms over the kids. But the key thing here is that Healthy Minds tries really hard to make the program fun, engaging, motivating, stimulating, etc. And you can also make it non-coercive by asking the students whether they want to do it as opposed to something else. All right, and the final one is social boosts. So social boosts are investment in community infrastructure, for example, meeting places, walkability so that people bump into each other on the street, clubs, green and blue spaces. And it's a kind of quite famous example of this is the Men in Sheds program, which gets guys into sheds to build things like cars and tinker. And typically they build things for the community. So they'll be repairing the scoreboard at the local baseball field, that kind of stuff. And the idea is that this tackles social isolation and feelings of incompetence among particularly the elderly and the unemployed. So it's definitely a psychological intervention in many ways, and you are improving people's mental states, right? You're improving their feelings of competence, feelings of isolation. It's a capacity building program because you build mental health skills, in particular social coping mechanisms. So you feel bad, I'm going to go hang out with the lads in the shed and improve my situation. It's empowering. Community psychology skills are transferable across different social domains. You can go from the shed to your household and apply similar skills. And it's inherently participatory. It's always social, it's collective. It gets the whole community involved in this program and people are participating in it as a group. There's been a recent impact evaluation of this that found that it was really quite effective on a range of criteria. Right, so to summarize, and I apologize for talking for so long, the policy success of behavioural public policy was a function of the coherent and sufficiently strong normative foundation that was provided by Libertarian Paternalism. So we think that well-being public policy will need a similarly compelling normative foundation, and we think that it doesn't really have that at the moment. Unfortunately, Libertarian Paternalism does not fit well-being public policy particularly well, and that's mostly because it transgresses this welfare idea that citizens' preferences are quite sacrosanct in liberal democracy. A lot of people think this is good. You know, people have dumb preferences, but as I said, this is a bit of a tricky thing to invoke. It's also weak on effectiveness for now, but I think most of the advocates of well-being public policy are aggressively pursuing higher quality evidence, and it's just as bad as behavioural public policy on autonomy, I think. Boosts provide a viable, but it has to be said, stricter framework for well-being public policy, and I think that strictness is not necessarily a problem. You know, as we embark on early cases of well-being public policy, we should look for things that are relatively uncontroversial, welcome, and kind of ethically bulletproof, because that's more likely to be successful and that'll spur further investment and further interest. The key principles of boosting are capacity, empowerment, and participation, and I'd also say that they tend to be quite modest. All right, thanks very much. Yeah, long talk from me. I'm happy to take questions from anybody. Joseph?
Yeah. Yes, excellent. I learned a lot, especially about libertarian paternalism, and you're absolutely right. There are definitely ethical flaws in relation to the application of libertarian paternalism in behavioral public policy.
Thanks.
And whether that would translate in terms of to well-being public policy is definitely a good point. Now, your remedy of all of this boils down to the boost principle that you're talking about in terms of capacity, empowerment, and participation. And you're talking about coming up with some sort of an ethics bulletproof type of an argument. Why do you believe that capacity capacity, empowerment, and participation are essentially ethical. They're essentially bulletproof. What's the ethical reasoning behind these three principles?
Right. So I definitely wouldn't say that they're bulletproof. I think you can critique boosts, and I think you can also justify well-being public policy that is not a boost. It's just that you'll be rubbing up against some ethical controversies, and it will be necessary to kind of justify what you're doing. So for example, I think you can definitely justify well-being budgeting, but it is tricky. And I think a lot of the advocacy for well-being budgeting has not really engaged with a lot of the quite long-standing critiques. In terms of where these principles come from, I think for the most part, they are responses to critiques. So there's been long-standing kind of debates around behavioural public policy in particular. And so boosting was presented as a framework that can promote a lot of the kind of stuff that is involved in nudging. So for example, improving people's financial decision-making in a way that doesn't have all the same problems as nudges. So for example, if you have the participation criterion, then you're not going to bypass people's reasons. And so some of the things that I covered under critiques of rationality aren't going to be as salient if you're framing things as a boost and really paying attention to that participation as if you were doing things as a nudge. So that's the kind of immediate practical origins of these concepts. More broadly, though, a lot of these concepts rest on, I think, quite long-standing themes in liberal democratic political philosophy. So participation is a really big part of the present turn towards deliberative democracy in democratic theory. That representative democracy seems to have limitations. It's kind of more open to capture by vested interests, for example, and it has too much of a kind of principal agent-based relationship with the citizen, whereas ultimately we would like to have the citizen be more empowered. And so one way to do that is to have more participatory mechanisms. Similar kind of things with the capacity idea. Capacity is very similar, I think, to the capabilities framework, which has emerged out of this idea that one way that we can ensure that governments really continue to promote the objective circumstances of people is to think about how we can help them be who they want to be and do what they want to do. And the capacity principle here ensures that any well-being public policy that you introduce is going to foster people's capabilities. So I think there are both immediate practical experiences from behavioural public policy that we've derived some of these principles from, and then also kind of more long-standing ideas in political philosophy. But I would stress that they are still very much open to critique, and they're definitely not bulletproof. But I do think that they're it's quite a strict framework, and so I don't think that there'll be too many people that would be really incensed by a well-being intervention that was genuinely a boost.
Yeah, no, I definitely like the capacity, empowerment, participation. But I think you can do a better job grounding these ethical principles on established ethical philosophies.
Okay.
I think in terms of things like human development theory, I'm thinking in terms of moral psychology, in terms of social contract theory, in terms of virtue ethics, in terms of teleological ethics, in terms of deontological ethics, duty ethics. There's so many good ethical theories that you'd be able to borrow from in order to further justify those three principles. And I like them, but you know, I think you can further establish a solid ethical foundations for those principles. So I urge you to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. So it's already quite a long paper, but I'd certainly like to explore that in future work. So, and I think that's a really good point that you make, that we could really kind of develop this stuff much further and with much more of an engagement with the philosophy. I think so. Boosting is quite fresh. The kind of first paper on it, which was co-written by Ralph Hertwig, who's a philosopher, psychologist, and Tilbrunner Janov, who's a philosopher, was in 2015. We had quite good comments from Ralph. This paper is forthcoming in Perspectives of Psychological Science, where he kind of said similar things that are going on within the boosting community, that they're trying to really kind of flesh out a lot of the philosophical principles. So that's good. And I think I'll pass on some of what you said, because I think they're probably not exploring some of these options. So that's really good.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joseph. Malta, do you have a question? Oh, Chris, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want. You shouldn't need permission. But anyway, Malta, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, it's picking up, I think, on just some of the stuff that you just mentioned towards the end. You know, this whole debate between nudging and boosting obviously has deeper roots in, you know, you could say the fights between, you know, the heuristics and biases program on the one hand, Kahneman and Tversky, on the other hand, and Gigerentz's approach, etc. And I sometimes wonder whether the next generation of researchers, you know, tap into the same, like, you know, camp building stuff. And while I think it's good to have categories, right, and to at some point say, okay, there is a distinction, I wonder whether we do ourselves a favor when we characterize nudging in a very narrow sense and boosting then in this very wide sense. In the following way, and it's not, you know, a fundamental critique of your paper, it's more a meta remark, right? In the following way, I mean, you know, Sunstein went a long way and tried to introduce this idea of educative nudging and educative nudges, which are typically system 2 nudges, right? That, you know, would try to build your capacity, that would try to empower you, right? Well, the participation is maybe still the weakest, but I still think also the boost paradigm is the weakest in terms of participation. You know, really this idea that I invite you as a subject to the table and we come to an agreement what is really heuristic that you yourself as the subject apply. I still think both have a lack in this, you know, participation, and it's ultimately either the psychologists get Gigerenzer coming to the table and say, how can we improve, you know, the decision situation, or it's the Kahneman type person who says, okay, ultimately, here we go, that's what research tells us. But I wonder, you know, just in terms of these educative nudges and boosting differences, whether you really see still this fundamental distinction and whether you really want to stress that, or whether we just should say, well, there is a huge overlap and actually a convergence on a critical point that is leading actually into the direction that you're pointing towards, right, in your paper. And namely, really this idea that, well, yes, it's true, we might be less effective if we have a higher capacity and empowerment orientation, both in the nudging and boosting stuff. But, you know, we live in a liberal society. So that's ultimately when we talk about policy making, it's just, you know, the path forward. What do you think about that? I mean, it's sort of like a mixed bag, my remark, but I'd be curious to hear.
So I'm broadly in agreement. You know, I used to be very angry, and I think I was very, like, you know, a camp builder. But I've mellowed dramatically in the last 2 years, and so now I'm always kind of looking for ways for people to, like, get along and try to figure out their differences and what the Venn diagram is, where they overlap. And I think you're right that nudging and boosting have huge overlaps, like much more than maybe the advocates of each side would confess or would acknowledge. And I think it's interesting to kind of place that in the context of these ethical frameworks as well, of like, what are the more controversial nudges from the boosters' point of view? What are the less controversial ones? I don't think that anyone in the boost camp would be really upset by the piano stairs, for example. But they might be more upset by some other boosts like the plates or something like that. Yeah, so it'd be interesting to kind of have them talk more about where they think boosting is really required, and then other areas where nudging is fine because it's just kind of very gentle and not really that much of a problem. I think there's a tendency among academics in particular to, I think, be quite absolutist about some principles. And you know, I think I've been a little bit guilty of, or we've been a bit guilty of that in this paper, saying that certain things are just off limits. You can't go there. Actually, I think you can go there, and ultimately what matters is whether you get democratic assent, and then you can justify a lot of things on the basis of public opinion. But yeah, so I think broadly, I think I agree with your sentiment, and I got the sense from Ralph Hertwig in our conversations with him that that's the direction they're going anyway. Yeah, so we'll see. Ashley, did you have a question?
Yes. So first of all, thanks very much for the paper. I really enjoyed it. The one small thing, I'm not a fan of libertarian paternalism, but the critique by Sen, as you know, he's essentially retracted it by now, because they began to recognize the paradox of the miserable millionaire and the happy peasant has been grossly inflated. When people have empirically tried to find it, there are examples, but they're not anywhere as pervasive as claimed. People do adjust to the misery. I won't dispute that part of it, but there is some evidence to indicate that Diener has done some work on that, in particular on that element. I like the boost model, but the Achilles heel is, I think, is the dependence on participation, because what ends up happening is you end up with a conflict with the democratic theorists in this regard. You end up with a group that's defined X, and then if it's in opposition for whatever reason to what elected people want, it's the elected people who essentially trump that. I hate to use that word these days, that verb these days, but and unless you manipulate the situation, a good example is in Ireland when they went through 2 referendums to change their abortion laws. And for example, they made sure in the participation that they had representation by elected officials at the table to make sure part of, and also, as my Irish friends will point out, incredible amount of lobbying in the back end by some of the groups to make sure that it occurred. So there is this dilemma about legitimacy. If you've got group X that expresses this as their preferences, how is, and they don't have power over the budget. They're not making the budget. They're not making the laws. They're dependent on this other group to do it. And they can choose to ignore it or modify it in such ways to deviate it. It seems to me we don't have a good way, we don't have a mechanism yet to reconcile those differences. I'm not saying either is right. I'm just saying no real mechanism. And the participation one is particularly vulnerable because invariably it's not everybody who participates. If we have a problem with elections, because other than in Australia where you have people who are sitting on the sidelines, that's particularly true in the participation environment, in the deliberative environment, where the self-selection factor is substantially more pervasive and on things.
So yeah, that's a good point. And I think this is a very big part of the discussion around deliberative democracy, and I also want to confess that I'm like pretty skeptical of deliberative democracy, and used to be a hardcore representative Democrat until quite recently. So I totally take your point that if you overemphasize participation, you end up with a tyranny of the minority kind of situation, which is not ideal. A couple of things that I'd say about that. So boosting is boosting is something that we think applies in quite a narrow circumstance, right? And it's quite possible that a lot of well-being public policy doesn't fit into that circumstance, but it's still something that you want to get done. We present boost mostly as a framework that you can use to make some progress on well-being public policy that is relatively ethically straightforward, right? So if you want to introduce a training program in your local government area to help people with social isolation, for example, then you can frame it as a boost. You can do men in sheds and you're off to the races. You don't really need to worry too much about whether this is a representative or participatory system, although I can totally see that that might be a factor. At the kind of grander level than that, if you're thinking about, say, swapping budgeting over from using equivalent income to using life satisfaction as the main input variable, then it could be much more difficult to get participatory mechanisms in place. And so what I'd say in that situation is where you can't frame that as a boost, but you still might want to do it, and it might still be ethically fine to do it. You're just going to need a different normative paradigm. And the libertarian paternalism paradigm won't work, neither will boosts, but maybe you can use something different. I just think that the key, I guess the key message, or the fundamental message of this paper is that there are a lot of ethical issues involved in applying well-being science in public policy. And I think a lot of the advocacy so far has been mostly coming from a very technical point of view and not so much engaging with a lot of these ethical issues. The ethical issues are often kind of assumed. They're just like, oh, this must be a good thing. And I'm really not sure that that's the case. I think a little bit more lifting needs to be done on that front. So yeah, I think I take your point. I think this participatory stuff, I think, is often kind of impractical. And a lot of the advocates who promote it don't necessarily seem to appreciate how impractical it is and how unrepresentative it can be and all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of the applications of it, like mini publics and this kind of stuff, are still quite young, and there still remains a lot of problems to iron out on that front as well. So I'm certainly not suggesting that well-being public policy can only be justified as a boost. It's more saying that if you want to proceed with well-being public policy in a way that I think most people are going to welcome, then a good place to start would be to look for opportunities to boost. Is that, I hope that was a constructive comment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think always to the extent that you can show that whatever you're doing is consistent with outcomes that people want, and that's, I don't mean that in a libertarian, and B, is done with their concurrence, which is what you're implying with the participation, then the viability of that policy is much more likely to be sustained over time. So yeah, I mean, as I say, we're always seeking, I think, finding an ethical framework that encourages people to grow and develop, which essentially is what Boost is doing, or preventing them from being restrained in inappropriate ways, then I think it's great. But I think actually we could concretize these matters if we look at today's issue, at least in my country, more so in the States and in some other countries, is practices people are going to engage in terms of COVID. So whether or not wear masks, right? I mean, you've got groups that are, and I use the word advisedly, conspiring to make sure that people don't use protective measures. They're in a state of denial that there's a problem, right? Some way intend to try to diminish it. I suspect having a participant, and I blow hot and cold in this. I think if you try to sit down with those individuals and try to work through what their fears and anxieties would be, I would like that in one level. I don't think I'd have the stomach to do it personally, but I'd like it. But I'm also not convinced that you would see much change in behavior. And yet that's the case where you're going back to your technocrats, where I think there's compelling evidence to indicate that technocrats, the scientific knowledge, may be more compelling than the democratic whims.
Yeah, and you might be able to justify that through a utilitarian argument or something of that sort, or even a kind of majoritarian social contract argument, something like that. So I think, yeah, that's a good point, and I definitely don't want to suggest that this is the only way to justify well-being public policy.
Yeah, I always think with the people on the anti-mask side, well, I always want to drive on the other side of the road.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Malta, did you have a follow-up? I realized that I kind of cut you off a bit quickly there. I moved on too fast.
No, it's fine. I mean, we know each other, and I think we're largely in agreement here. And it's more about, and I like the paper, because it has that constructive note. I think that's great towards the end. And I myself am just like, with this boosting, I think sometimes it's, how how can I express that? You know, it's easy to trash then the nudging stuff on the one hand. You didn't do that. I mean, you try to present it in a very, like, you know, charitable way.
I like that.
Yeah, I know. No, but what I mean is, and the boosting, I think itself needs to have that thorough analysis that we often give to nudging, and to really see, hey, where's actually the common ground? You know, that's kind of like more my take on this question between boosting and nudging. And what I like is actually this, what you said towards the very end, that the common ground is, I think, really the level of intervention. It's a similar idea, you know, how you try to address the individual level and with all its problems, right? I mean, you still have, you know, the question of institutional reforms. You have the question of all the democratic participation and stuff. It's not really meant in that way, right? It has a similar level of targeting the audience. And then it's the idea really to carve out the differences. And I think you do a good job. So I'm really not pushing back against what you've done in the paper. I think it's great. And obviously I just, you know, I'm teaching behavioral economics, and in this class I really also try to say, you know, there's the Gerd Gigerenzer type ecological rationality, then you have you know, on the other hand, the heuristics and biases people. But what I feel it's intellectually not really satisfying for moving forward to think of these two camps. That's at least my take on it. And I think that what you do towards the end of the paper is great, that constructive point. And I think it also moves beyond that bashing idea. And I think you don't do it in the paper. So I think largely my point is actually mute. So
okay,
great job.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad to hear that we don't do the bashing, because that's something that I think I was much more prone to as a PhD student, and I'm kind of I'm impressed with myself at how fast I've stopped engaging in bashing, because it's not a particularly like constructive thing to do, although it gets you a lot of cites, but often for the bad reasons.
Yeah, no. And I agree, you know, with Joseph's point that he said, you know, I think, you know, working more on the capacity empowerment participation stuff, you know, and grounding that and some normative reasoning is probably like a great follow-up project.
Yeah.
But no, great, and thanks for that. I mean, I saw an earlier version, right, of the working paper, and I was just curious how you break it down, and so thanks for that.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for coming.
And I have to head off. I have a office hour, so we'll talk to each other on Saturday, right?
Yeah, for sure. I'll see you then.
Okay, have a good one. Bye.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you much longer.
No, that's all right. I've got plenty of time.
I do, as I said, I looked a lot of it. I was particularly happy when you.
Sorry, the connection's really bad.
Sorry?
The connection's really bad, so you might have to kill the video. But good to put a face to the name.
Okay, that's. Yeah, I was going to do that to let you see me. I normally have it off because of the audio problem.
Oh, right.
For some
It
reason,
seems okay now.
I'm not sure. Am I showing up? No, I'm not.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah.
Okay. So what I particularly started really getting excited about in terms of boost was the link back to the social, because what a lot of the capability stuff does, and even the nudge stuff, is it tends to emphasize just the individual as an atom, as psychologically. I mean, it, and yet we know, and this is one of the, I think, contributions of the well-being literature, was the importance of the social cohesion parameter as being one of the underlying factors contributing towards life satisfaction.
Yeah.
And arguably, even in the case of eudaimonia, I used to be able to know how to pronounce that, say that. Purpose often implies a social dimension. It doesn't always, but always. So to the extent that we can get back things in a social framework, then again, you're taken outside of just the individual responsibility issue. And I know that's the nub of it. But that also gets me back to one of the things I think indeed is the most compelling way to improve people's well-being is to the extent that we change both the physical and the social environment. And I mean, you alluded to the workshops and the walkability, and there's, and arguably goes back to what we were saying on by email, that when you have the social infrastructure of supports, whether it's, in our case, Canada, we have comprehensive Medicare, and we, well, we have some things that are excluded, which unfortunately should be in there, but we do, unlike the States, we have a universal healthcare policy. And indeed, most of the countries that have good, social welfare policies, right, you end up with those kind of environmental supports, social supports, to allow people to grow. But the one point I was going to make, I thought Chris would make, because he was listening for a while, is on the argument about how to go from the well-being measures back to what matters in terms of the regression. His argument is, and indirectly addresses the critique of using well-being for policy. Has sometimes been, and I know it was expressed by the chief statistician for the OECD's group. I'm trying to remember her name for a moment. Yes, yeah. At the last conference, she made the point that well-being measures in and of themselves are not forward-looking, in the sense that it's true, we have trouble, and this is one of our biases, we have trouble imagining what our future state of happiness will be. We can sometimes do it, but often fool ourselves in terms of how happy we'll be if we do X, Y, and Z. Chris's argument always is you then, what you look at is not yourself, but essentially, or at least this is the way I interpret it, you would look at it essentially at your cohort, X years in advance, to see whether or not they find that kind of measure. Right now, it gets problematic when that cohort didn't get exposed to the stimulus that you're talking about. But at least to temper this simple regression / correlation model, which I agree is people spend a lot of time doing their panel models and hoping that it will tease out a causal effect. But nonetheless, if we indeed can at least use what our peers are, or our peers plus 10, or our peers plus 20, we might get a better sense of what a policy change today will do for a generation, a current generation 10 years hence. But anyway, that's a
right. Yeah, I've heard Chris make, so thank you for articulating that to me, because I've heard Chris kind of allude to this argument in the past, but never fully explain it. So, and he said that he came in late because of a calendar failure, because we're across like 4 time zones, but that he'll look for the video, because I was quite interested in his perspectives on what I'd said. So my concern, I think Chris kind of assumes that there's not much measurement error in life satisfaction scales. And if that's true, then his argument holds quite powerfully, and I think really should be taken seriously. My concern, and I'll present this paper tomorrow, is that I think there's really big measurement error. And so so there was a paper, I don't know if you were listening to the eHero sessions, but I think the very last paper in that was by a PhD student in Canada, who I think actually works with Chris, who shows that, life satisfaction is flat over time. People expect it to improve when they're young, and then get worse when they're older, and it doesn't, it just stays flat. But they remember it improving when they're younger and getting worse as they're older. And so there's this argument, you can take the view that this is all recall bias and prospecting errors, or you can take the view that people are shifting their scales over time. And my sense is that they're shifting their scales, in which case it might be that actually people have a very good understanding of their life satisfaction over time, and it's the researchers who are erroneous in their perspectives, which would be a very kind of radically different perspective on this. Now, I don't have conclusive evidence, and the evidence that I present tomorrow is definitely not conclusive, but I don't think we've done nearly enough research on this issue.
Well, certainly, first of all, Angus Deaton would agree with you that there's lots of measurement error in simple social well-being measure. I remember looking at a German book a couple of years ago. I don't remember the authors, and they make the point. They were more in the traditional economic framework, but they were making the argument, of course, that social well-being is in the end, we think comparatively, not absolutely. And so then the question is, are you comparing yourself to your past or to your peers?
Yeah.
While they in the end say you still have to do it, there is some element of truth in the point that it may well be, if you're looking at your peers or you're looking at and of course, even in life cycle, right? I mean, there's independent data to show that during people's prime, when they're raising kids, their social well-being tends to diminish. Well, their stress levels go up, and as the kids leave, they tend to relax a bit. So there is some evidence of that. Actually, way back when, when I first exposed to social well-being, there was a book written by Herzberg. I still have it, out of University of Michigan. She didn't use social well-being. She used what's called the DT scale, delighted terrible, which was a predecessor from the 80s, and looked at people's DT measures over time and over the and generationally. And she shows that indeed it rises, flattens, goes up a bit, and then goes down towards the last 10 years or so of people's lives, because particularly in the United States, where you don't have good health care and you've got all sorts of other stresses, your chances of not feeling so well suddenly increase. Whereas my mother used to say to me, money is great, but you need your health.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, so these are all big themes, and I guess we'll have to keep plugging away at them.
But
yeah.
But
anyway.
no, yeah. But so yes, there is measurement error. The question is whether it swamps the modes. I mean, I want to go back to that because fundamentally what it comes down to is what part of if you've got a social well-being measure, and even if it's eudaimonic, and I'd like to know which scales you were using, because I end up using the OECD one, represented one, and when I've done it in the past, I haven't found that it teased out anything that was different from the social well-being one. They were all highly correlated. So, I mean, yeah, I want purpose and meaning to be valuable, but it's fundamentally, and I haven't looked at any framework. I'd like to use that measure and see whether we could see any kind of sequential or causal relation pattern to the story. Okay.
Well, I'll send you the stuff that I've come across in the space. I'm definitely not an expert on measurement, but I can forward you Felicia Hoopert's work in particular, and she's been highly critical of the life satisfaction stuff and arguing that we need a much kind of richer multidimensional measure. And they just published a paper in 2010 or this year that I thought was pretty excellent. But it is kind of pyrotechnic in the statistics, so it's quite a heavy read. And yeah.
That's okay. I mean, I'll struggle through it, but I must admit, one of the things I do like about social well-being more than the capabilities, and I do like capabilities to some extent, is the multidimensional ends up being a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
You get lost in it. I mean, I watched a presentation done about Bhutan because what's her name out of Oxford had worked with
Sabina Al-Khair.
Yeah. And she talked about this thing in Bhutan. Okay, so first of all, it was a top-down thing. We're going to go with we're going to do it. And you end up with 5 years of development, without an exaggeration, several hundred measures of what's going on. And you know what's going to happen. You're going to find some measures are going to change positively. Some measures will change negatively. And if, depending on which side of the line, you'll point to the positive or you'll point to the negative. I think it is, and this part of Halliwell I like. I think having a lingua franca of a single measure as an umbrella framework, not as the only measure, but as an umbrella measure, is useful for facilitating those discussions. And so I look forward tomorrow in terms of the measurement issues, because yeah, I mean, I remember using one little place I was working, we used Diener's measures first because that was the traditional one, and he had lots of scoring, and then we put it in the social well, the 10-point scale again, and again there were, yeah, if you want to tease out a small segment that are at variance, yeah, but it's a small segment of. So, but anyway, that's it. I look forward to reading the paper because, but I as I said, the wrestling with I went through a deliberate democracy jag this last, well, for about 9 months or so, but I got my head snapped in one sense when I started looking at, I watched a good discussion from a political scientist about, okay, what is this? You know, now he's a more traditional political scientist, but he had a fair point.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of fair points to be made.
Yeah. But I agree. I mean, finding and conversely, why I like Boost and what you're trying to do is as much as we talk about well-being, it isn't being incorporated fast enough or well enough, if I can put it that way, in lots of places. It hasn't quite captured people's imagination, and I think it's because indeed it might be something's missing there. So anyway, enough of my parameter. I should let you do some work. Thank you very, very much. Look forward to more.
Thanks for your comments. See you later.
See you later. Okay, ciao.